Evening, everyone. You can be seated. Welcome to another Peaceful Solution Character Education program, a teacher certification course. Welcome back here. Do appreciate everyone coming and being a part of this collective effort to build our characters, of course, first and foremost, but also to train to teach others how to develop a positive character, and not just develop one, but maintain it as well. And that's what we've been covering throughout the past few lessons, and pretty much every lesson that we've covered through these first 4 units, it kind of is laid out the same way. What it is that we must do to change ourselves from the inside. And I'll remind everybody, if you do have a book, or if you can, which we hopefully that you have downloaded the Peaceful Solution from the Facebook page there. They're free downloads, PDF downloads up to the unit that we're covering now. Now we have one more unit to go after this in the intermediate series, which is the responsibility unit. But you'll see that the motto of the Peaceful Solution is to change the hearts and the minds, change the way we think and change the way we feel, right? Because this is the source of our character. This is an influence for the decisions that we make, and of course, the outcome of our lives, how we affect our lives and the lives of those that we interact with on a daily basis, even displaced, right? We might not necessarily interact with a particular person, but you see people who have done things in the past. Maybe they've committed crimes, maybe they've kidnapped children and things of that nature, and communities or states will pass, or even the federal government will pass laws, and then sometimes they'll name them after the child, like Susie's Law or Jared's Law or something like that, because of the actions of a particular individual, right? So we need to remember that the ripple effect of our actions, they could ripple out just a little bit, or they can ripple out very far. Either way, what the goal of what we're wanting to accomplish here is that, like we covered previously, for every action, there's a reaction. For every cause, there's an effect. We want to make sure that we affect the world in a positive way, right? And that's the main thing of what we're wanting to cover here. So we are in Unit 4, Chapter 5, responding to disrespect here. And this is, we have 2 more chapters to go after this. Let me get my place here. All right. And we were covering, we're pretty close to the end here. But we're talking about, in the last few classes, we've been covering responding to disrespect from the opposite sex. Now, this has been a problem not just since the Me Too movement. This has been going on for hundreds, if not thousands of years. People not respecting the opposite sex for one reason or another. What do we know that to be? Because of a lack of education, a lack of respect for other people, and so forth. People acting impulsively. Remember, not considering what the results of their actions will bring, and just kind of, saying things. Wolf whistling is one thing that you see that's real common in society. And there's been a few. I think they're influencers, or they run social media blogs or whatever, and they've done experiments, what they call social experiments, where they'll just take a camera, I think it's like a hidden camera, and they'll walk kind of the streets of New York, and just to kind of get, how many men, wolf whistle at them, or make remarks or make comments. And I think there was a guy that actually did the same thing, and he had the same thing take place with him as well. So people don't, our society, and sadly, this is, to some degree, I want to say here in the United States, it's kind of a cultural thing. It's not just in the United States, but here, it's definitely more widely accepted than it is like in some other cultures where modesty is taught and upheld, and they don't like people coming in. And in some of these places, like we talked about in the previous classes with the different cultures, you might be a guest at a man's house, and you'll never see his wife or his daughter, right? Because they maintain a particular type of separation when there are male guests around. Or if you do, they might be covered up, their face. They might have a veil on their face or something like that. They just have certain cultural norms that they maintain. And part of it is for the reason to prevent what we see in society today, right? Like it's the norm to just, vocalize how you feel or what you think about that other person and the way they look. Well, these things we have to be very mindful of. And of course, we're teaching, the young men and the young women who are in this age range of 11 to 13 years old, that these things are in society. More than likely, they're going to experience these things in their environments, in school, but they need to learn how to respond to these types of actions that are directed towards them. In fact, these disrespectful actions that are directed towards them, not to, kind of just let it go, not to giggle and, kind of show that it's accepted or that it's okay to speak with me in that way, because, one thing can easily lead to another. And like we talk about here, it can be very easy for signals to be mixed up. And when you have a group of people, both young men and both young women, who have not been trained in moral character, who don't understand the value of respect, the value of ownership. Some people just don't understand the word no. They don't respect the word no, right? And they'll engage in activities that lead to what we covered all the way at the very beginning of the unit, the courses here in chapter 1 of the character unit, which is the risk-taking behavior. And it comes from both sides. It's not only coming from men to women, young men to young women, but it comes from women to men too as well, right? So the goal is to help them recognize it, because remember, this is also a time period where there's a lot of changes taking place in their mind with hormones and so forth, and they need to be able to learn at this critical point how to keep themselves in check, right? Keep their thoughts, keep their feelings, keep their desires in check. And that's what these lessons, part of what these lessons are for. So let's go back real quick. I just want to catch my spot here. We're in procedure number 9, kind of in the middle of procedure number 9. I'll just read the whole thing. It says, this is lesson plan 5, page E. Tell students that the last type of disrespect they will explore in this lesson is responding to disrespect from the opposite sex. Have students read the section responding to disrespect from the opposite sex found on pages 140 through 141 in their handbooks, and complete the accompanying exercise found on page 142, which is what we're planning on covering this evening. Stress that both males and females have an obligation, right? This is something that they are obligated to do. Kind of like what we covered at the very beginning, who deserves respect? All people deserve respect. Irregardless of their status in life or how they've treated you in the past or how they might treat you in the future. All people deserve respect. So if they deserve respect, the person giving it is obligated to show respect to that person. And in doing so, they're actually showing respect for themselves, right? They're showing that they are in control of the way that they think, the way that they feel, and the way that they act. And with that moral strength of character, they're going to go pretty far in life. Now, they might not see it at the time. They might not see, not retaliating when someone says something or does something disrespectful to you as a sign of moral strength, because society is taught, again, this is what some of the influences that have come from movies and video games and music and just, being in the environment in school. People like to instigate, right? If somebody says something about another person or says something about maybe their shoes or the way that they dress, and then what do the instigators do? Ooh, no, you're going to let them say that about you? Man, you're not going to go out like that, are you? The girls are looking, right? And they instigate. And at the same time, they want to call themselves your friends, right? They're trying to instigate you to engage in behavior that can, at the very least, get you, suspended. It can get you a detention, in school. Depending on the severity of the incident, you could actually be expelled, and it could be put on your record, right? Not to mention if you if you can't really fight, you could get beat up too, and have the embarrassment to deal with in that regards, right? But a true friend wouldn't do that. A true friend would actually tell you, what, man, don't worry about it. Let's just get to class, right? Don't even pay any attention to that. But it's hard to find true friends because people don't know what to look for in a friend. Most of the time, they're only looking at the personality, the similarities that they have in the type of music, food, clothing, and things of that nature, instead of the decisions that the person will make, the character of the person. Stress that both males and females have an obligation, there's a key word there, obligation, to treat each other with respect by dressing appropriately and refraining from making sexual comments or jokes in each other's presence. All right. Also, I would add to that, not making comments, sexual comments or jokes when you're not around the person either, right? That'd be, just think of it in this regard, and not that the peaceful solution, disregarded that, but just, as in teaching this lesson, make sure your students understand that so they don't go, well, I didn't say it in their presence, all right? Yeah, but if you're around your quote-unquote friends and you're talking about this and you're joking about this other person, this girl, and the way she looks and the figure of the on her body and so forth, or if girls are doing that about a guy, what is that doing to the mind of those who are there? Especially if nobody's standing up and saying, hey, listen, that's not respectful. Right? We shouldn't be talking about it. We should actually, show respect when we're interacting and talking to her. Now, that's not typical language of most teenagers, but you get the drift, however they would word it in today's language. If nobody's standing up and saying that, that's going to reinforce that behavior in the mind of the person who's making these sexual comments or jokes. And they're going to think, well, my friends don't mind, so I can keep going on this way. And the more you talk about these things, what do you think it's going to do when that person is in that environment? The people's attentions are going to be directed towards that. Now, the problem with this that people don't realize is that some people, right, like the person who's making the comments or jokes, not that it's right, but they might not be the type of person to act on those things. But there might be another person in that group who does not have that self-control. Now you've directed your attention or their attention to this person who they otherwise might not have even taken note of before. And not only did you direct their attention to her or him if it's a girl towards a boy, but now you've accentuated certain things in their minds. So when they see that person, they're going to be looking at those things that those sexual jokes or comments were talked about. And there are situations like that. Remember, Chris and William, they talked about there are people who, some people do have mental issues. And sometimes those mental issues, they take away the inhibition, kind of like how alcohol and drugs affect the mind. They take away the person's sense of reasoning and their inhibitions to do things that they, and otherwise, if they were in the right state of mind, wouldn't do, right? Because they know that there's consequences or trouble associated with that. Well, so we shouldn't be doing these things, whether we're in that person's presence or we're outside of their presence, because, of course, that is not respectful. So let's look back over to page 142, because we're going to pick up where William left off last time. Now, he was finished off on page 141 and showing, some of the tips, to keep in mind for both young men and young women, and how they must, conduct themselves and dress in order to maintain this respectful character that they should be working to build as we go through these lessons here. On page 142, we're looking at this section here, true or false. Now, if you're joining us here online, you can see on my next slide there, this is from the students' workbook. So you'll notice, I know most of you and probably some of you online who are joining us, in case you don't have your book or online book, well, that's great. This doesn't have the answers on it. Of course, you should know the answers, hopefully, if you've been following along. But we're going to look at this true or false section here, and then we'll we'll go through it here a little bit. It's 4 questions, and it says read each sentence. Now this is something, of course, you will go through with your class after you've covered, the lessons on page 140 and 141, and rehearse that or refresh that in the minds of the students. Even if you go, like say on a day like today, if you were to come to the class today and start this lesson, it would be a great idea to go back, and we're going to do that in this lesson, so we're not going to go back right now, but go back before the quiz, the pop quiz, so to speak, and kind of refresh the minds of your students on what they're going to be covering, right? So they're not going to be stumped. Of course, this is only 4 questions, but a lot goes on throughout the week. So look at the first one there. Now remember, this is true or false. Both males and females should dress, speak, and act appropriately at all times. And of course, the answer to that is true. If you just, like I said, we're going to be covering that as we go through the answers, because we're, as teachers training. If you go back to page 141, just on the back page there, and if you look at the very first smiley point there, under girls, keep these tips in mind. And it just reminds them, dress, speak, and act appropriately at all times. Now, even the things that we're reading for that is directed towards the girls, some of these things also apply to the young men as well. Young men should also dress, speak, and act appropriately at all times, not just applying to the girls, right? Both men and women. If you don't want to be disrespected, then you must treat yourself with respect. Now, that is not to say that just because they treat themselves with respect, just because they dress respectfully, speak respectfully, and act appropriately, that someone else might not come and show them disrespect. Remember what we're talking about, responding to disrespect, okay? But at least they're not setting the stage and opening the door for disrespect to be directed towards them. If a person just chooses to act that way, or they're, having a bad day, or that's just part of their character, well, you just kind of deal with it as it comes. But you're not opening the door. It's like, I hate to use this example, but, if you were to drive down to the red light district of a particular major city, and you were to see people dressed provocatively walking up and down the roads, around certain centers, what would you think those people were there for, right? As runway models for a fashion show at 2 o'clock in the morning? Probably not. They're probably engaging in prostitution or solicitation of sexual services. And you can tell by the way they dress, by the way they act, by the way they speak. Okay? So these things are characteristics. You can see these things in people, and this is why it's so important to really drive this in the minds of our young men and women, how important dress is, and how you can show actually respect or disrespect for yourself by the way you dress. And people say, I dress the way I want to. It's freedom of expression. Sure, I understand that. You have the right to dress the way you want to dress. But don't be surprised if you're caught up in something because of the way you're dressed, that guilt by association, terminology, or I thought you were, a prostitute the way you were dressed, How dare you talk to me that way, I bet you people aren't walking up to 80-year-old grandmas and soliciting them for those types of services, because they're not dressed. Well, nowadays they probably are. I have no idea, But they don't dress that way. They dress with modesty and respect for themselves. Respect also for their husbands and their families. It's in some cultures it's considered extremely disrespectful for a young woman to go out and to expose parts of her body to the general public. It's not something she even does in her own household, but to go out and do that to the general public. In fact, some of the forms of shame, which I'm not saying this is right or an acceptable thing to do, it's kind of contrary to getting the point across. What they'll do is they'll actually rip parts of clothing off of people because it's considered shameful, right? This is done in some cases for both men and women. So dress, speak, and act appropriately at all times. If you don't want to be disrespected, then then you must treat yourself with respect. And that's the first person, of course, that we must learn to respect, is ourselves. And that's what we teach all the way at the very beginning of this lesson. And if you look down to the boys section there, boys, keep these tips in mind. It says, use self-control to avoid saying or doing anything that could be interpreted as a sexual advance, right? And you think about that, sexual advance, the purpose of it in everything they do and they say to the young woman is for the goal of advancing to the next step or advancing to the next level. I think they used to call it, I think it probably goes all the way back to the 50s and 60s, bases. Oh, did you get to first base? Did you get to second base? Did you get to third base? And they use these terminologies, to kind of give an idea to their friends of how far they got with a young lady. Or young ladies might be talking about it with a young man, right? But the whole purpose is advance to the goal in their minds of just, having sex with somebody. And then after that, they don't really care about them anymore, right? And this is the sad reality that a lot of people go through, and it leaves people with, again, I go back once again to chapter 1 of the character unit, these risk-taking behaviors that, bring about STDs. I think there was an article we were just talking about, I was talking about it a couple days ago with some of the other teachers of the Peaceful Solution, and we were just showing how, we remember seeing an article, I think it was, I don't know if it was in Georgia or Alabama, it might have been Georgia, one of the schools in Georgia, they actually had to shut the school down because they had an outbreak of, it was either gonorrhea or chlamydia or something. It was an STD, but it was an outbreak in the school, right? So many students had been getting this, and the parents were just like shocked. The teachers were just shocked, right? I don't understand how something like this is taking place. The schools need to do a better job. The parents blame the teachers blame the parents. Everybody wanted to blame everybody else. But the fact is that these things aren't taught. They're not taught to control their urges. They're not taught why they need to control these things. They're not taught the consequences that in that one moment they can get that can stick with them for the rest of their lives. Some of these STDs can actually cause a person to become sterile, where they can't have children, their own children, later on in the future. But they don't think about that because at the moment, the heat of the moment, as they call it, the heat of the moment, it's all fun and games. And they just want to have fun. They just want to do what feels good. Well, it says stop, think, and always choose to be respectful to someone of the opposite sex. So, of course, this is a choice that each individual must make, irregardless of what their peers, their associates, their quote-unquote friends might be saying to them. If we turn back to page 38 there, because this ties in great with this in regards to dress, and this is in the respect unit, page 38. And this is talking about taking care of yourself physically. All right, and this is chapter 2 here. And if you look down to the fourth paragraph there, just a little bit above the girl's head on the left side there, it says, taking care of yourself physically involves not only cleanliness and acceptance of your physical changes, but also involves the way you dress. So we actually, what we're covering here in chapter 5, right, we actually laid the groundwork, the Peaceful Solution laid the groundwork in the minds of the students all the way in chapter 2, because chapter 2 is talking about respect for ourselves. Chapter 5 is talking about how to respond to disrespect. And the very first thing that was spoken here under girls keep this tip in mind is do these things, dress, speak, and act appropriately if you don't want to be disrespected, right? So this groundwork was laid all the way back in chapter 2. Dressing appropriately or modestly is crucial to your self-respect. The fashion industry depends on people to conform. And remember, we covered about conformity. Remember, William talked about influences in the last class. And influence doesn't make you do something, right? It's just something that influences you, us, our students. They still have the opportunity at that time, before they act or before they say something, to decide on a different course of action, to decide on making the right choice. If they look at the influence and they compare it to what they've learned in the peaceful solution, and they've asked themselves the basic questions: will this bring harm to myself, others, or the environment? We also include, will this bring shame or embarrassment to myself or my family, right? Because that can also be a factor as well, by certain actions, certain things we say, certain ways that we dress. And then if it will, then I need to step away from it and look towards something else instead of going in that direction, irregardless if all my other friends or associates or everybody in the school is doing it. And it can be very, very difficult for somebody who's 11 to 13 years old to have the moral backbone, the moral fortitude to stand up against everybody else and be that one person who is going against the grain. Not that they're necessarily fighting with others, but just by their actions, by the choices that they make, by the way they decide to carry themselves, right? But that's that mental fortitude, right, that they have in doing so. And it's not impossible, but it is a difficult thing, because influences and conformity is a very strong thing, and it has been for a very long time, especially in school. So the fashion industry depend on people to conform to the latest styles in order to, quote unquote, fit in. Girls, now see, this is a warning to the girls: be careful about the style of clothes you wear. If they are skimpy or short, you will be compromising your self-respect. And this is something that, I think most of us who are, over 40, over 50 years old, we have been able to see the shift in what is culturally acceptable in regards to dress, in the last 50 or 60 years. I remember watching shows like Leave It to Beaver and All in the Family. Well, not All in the Family. That was a horrible show. That was a horrible show. Never mind. But even they still dressed a lot more appropriately. Their words weren't appropriate. What's that family with the two families came together? I can't remember what it was called. Anyway, but the attire that you saw in those shows, for both the men and the women, they were pretty modest. The mothers always wore, long dresses or skirts. Her blouses were not skin tight and fitting. The men wore, usually they always had a button down shirt. Even if they were working in the field, they always had some type of a button down shirt on and a pair of slacks that actually sat on their waist. They weren't wrapped around their knees. And the children, they dressed respectfully and appropriate as well. But as the years started to go by, certain things started to creep in more and more and more. And it was a slow creep in, kind of like they say the frog in the pot, right? Until it's become socially acceptable to see somebody who has, a 2-inch skirt on and high heels, and nowadays that might actually be the man. I don't know, and these are the new social norms that society has moved into, they've shifted into, because these industries, they thrive on conformity of other people. And so if they are skimpy or short, you will be compromising your self-respect. Now, you tie that into what we're talking about here on page 141. If you don't want to be disrespected, then you must treat yourself with respect. So, look at the boys here on the next sentence. It says, boys tend to think that girls are easy if they dress inappropriately. Now, that's not all boys, right? But even a young man who might be trained in the peaceful solution and seeing someone who is dressed like that, that thought might cross their mind. Not that they would act on it or anything, But from what they've learned in the peaceful solution, they would know that, hey, somebody who has respect for themselves would not dress in that type of a manner. Now, it could just be a matter of them not knowing. And that's 99% of the case what it is, right? They haven't been trained. Probably mom dresses that way, their sisters dress that way, the other people in their community dress that way, right? And so they don't know. They don't know any better. Once people are educated in these things and they see how it actually degrades them, right? They're a part of degrading themselves. Now, this is not to say that if a woman dresses inappropriately that she deserves to be disrespected. Now, this is not saying or condoning that in one bit. Remember, everyone is obligated to show everybody respect, right? But you got to keep in mind, not everybody is being trained in positive moral character. All right, so you're going to, it can be like putting a spotlight on yourself when you go out into the public with those types of outfits on. Boys, you two have an obligation, see here, there too, it's not just the women, the young ladies, to dress appropriately. Now here, using a belt when necessary to hold your pants in place shows respect. Baggy pants that fall below the hips and display your undergarments are not appropriate, especially when guys are not very hygienic, right? You know, I didn't realize they sold those with racing stripes, you might think to yourself, you know, because they don't keep themselves very clean, but they think it's okay to just wear their clothes hanging down and their undergarments are showing, okay? Neither is being in a public place without a shirt. Both males and females have a responsibility to respect themselves and each other by dressing appropriately. And personally, as a parent, and just a man in general, I don't want to see, another man's undergarments because he decides to walk down the road. And have you ever seen these guys actually try to run with their pants all the way to the middle of their waist? It's easy to catch them. You can't run that way. What's the first thing they have to do? They have to pull their pants up, right? Because they can't run. And I remember seeing this. Now, when I was in elementary school, in the 80s, I don't remember seeing that as a trend in dress. It wasn't until much later when I got into probably around, junior high, high school, definitely in high school, that I saw that was becoming more popular to the point even that, that had to actually be included in the school's dress code. That boys cannot wear pants that set below their waist. They can't wear these saggy or these overly baggy pants, because sometimes they would wear these overly baggy pants, not just, regular loose-fitting pants, but manufacturers were actually designing clothes to accentuate the bagginess, If we look at the next slide there, it says, this is not from the Peaceful Solution, I get a little bit from the Peaceful Solution, but this is a reminder to us, and this is something you can remind your students when you're teaching them. It says, remember, using a belt when necessary to hold your pants in place shows respect for yourself. If you don't, you could develop a condition in which a lot of people don't even know about this, and I don't know when it was classified or discovered or became an actual condition, but it's called LBS. And if you look at the next slide there, you can see that's called long or low bottom syndrome, right? That's when you see these characters here, their pants are so low, and it was really hard to find something that their shirts covered everything, because most of them, like I just mentioned, or we mentioned in the book here, the undergarments, were exposed. They were fully exposed. And this is how people walk around in society. But this was pretty commonplace, with pants that literally are hanging way, way down on a person's waist. Yeah, well, actually, that's not a waist. That's their thighs or something like that. And I guess this is considered cool. This is considered the norm in some cultures and so forth. But this is what it's talking about. If we look at the next slide, there were some cities actually that because of this, they actually enacted ordinances, enacted laws. And this was, I believe, Okalaka. Okalaka, is that what it is? Okalaka, Florida. Opalaka City in Florida. In their parks, they enacted or passed a law. It was either 2007 or 2008, somewhere around in there. An ordinance for this, the banning of wearing of saggy pants and apparel in Opalaka city parks and buildings. And it says no ifs, ands, or buts. It's the city law. And part of it was, the fine was, you could be fined $500. I think it was a misdemeanor or something like that, I'm not sure. But it was $500, or you could spend up to 6 months in jail, right? Or you can learn more of how to wear your pants inappropriately. And if you look at the next slide here, this is an article here that kind of ties in with that sign there. It says, officials in South Florida city have voted to repeal a law. Now they're planning to repeal it. Banning low waist bands in public spaces as a step towards providing fairer policies to its citizens, because of course people were complaining about it targeting just a particular group of people. On Wednesday, Opelika City Commission members repealed saggy pants ordinances from 2007 and 2013 in a 4-1 vote, officials said in a statement Thursday. The original 2007 city ordinance said that men could receive civil citations for wearing saggy pants with exposed underwear in city buildings and parks. In 2013, the law was expanded to include women in public spaces, Vice Mayor Chris Davis told CNN. All right, so, it got to the point where, obviously enough people had complained about it where they pushed their city officials to do something about it. We don't like seeing this type of address, in our neighborhoods. Can we do something about it? Well, of course, many years later, they voted to repeal it and so forth. But it was something that they valued enough to try to at least get an ordinance passed regarding it. Even in schools. Now, when we think about schools, we think about children and the dress codes that are enacted for the children as well. But one of the things that are overlooked and sometimes is the source of many of the problems that we see in the schools are the parents and their conduct when they come to the schools, right? Because back in the day when I was growing up, if I got a note sent home to my parent, I knew that my mother was going to side with the teacher, right? If I was disrupting the class or being I wasn't a bad person, but I was sometimes what they called a class clown. I knew that my mother would not, side with me on it. Whatever excuses that I made, she would not be siding with me on it. And I did not want her to find out if I got a note sent home to school because I was behaving inappropriately. Nowadays, if a note gets sent home with the student, the parent will come and curse the teacher out. Why are you sending a note home to my student? Do you not know who I am? Right? I'll have your job. You work for me. I pay taxes. You work for me. Now, you pass them on their great looks and their saggy pants. But they actually put some rules in for their parents. This was a high school in Houston. In our next slide there, it says, a Houston high school announced earlier this month that parents, notice here, they already have it in effect for the students, but now they're asking parents would need to conform to a dress code to be permitted to enter the school. A policy that has drawn media attention and scrutiny. How dare you demand that parents dress appropriately and respectful in a learning environment? The April 9th letter announced this policy. The policy is linked to James Madison High School's homepage. It lists an array of clothing that parents are not permitted to wear inside the school or at school events, including a satin cap or bonnet on their head, hair rollers. Now, my mom would have never been seen outside the house with hair rollers. Pajamas of any kind, which I've seen that taking place, and I'm just thinking, how lazy do you have to be to leave the house in your pajamas? Leggings that are showing your bottom and where your body is not covered from the front or back. A sagging pants. You see, that's another one there. Men wearing undershirts or the infamous Daisy Dukes. And that would apply to both men and women. The school which has a dress code for its students as well, according to Houston Independent School District, enacted the parental dress code to help create, notice here what the school is trying to do, and they are right for trying to do this, because we're trying to, you think about it, you're in a school and you're trying to educate the students. And a part of the reason for the dress code is to help the students' minds stay focused on just that, the education part of it. This is why a lot of schools have enacted uniforms, where students have to wear uniforms because they're all wearing the same thing. And it's not a dressing competition there to see who's got the latest or the hottest, clothing. No, you're all wearing the same thing. And you have to get your stuff from the same place, or it has to meet a certain criteria to eliminate that distraction, because dress can be very distracting, especially at that age or at any age. But it says here, they enacted the parental dress code to help create a professional educational environment. The principal wrote in the letter. She said, we have to have standards. Most of all, we must have high standards. And you would think, as a parent, you would want your child to go to a school that has and really tries to enforce and maintain high standards for the learning, what they're being taught, as well as the learning environment. Remember what we covered in the Peaceful Solution in the character unit. Your environment is also something that contributes to the development of your character. And if your environment is full of half-naked people and disrespecting the classroom, loud music and these types of things, it's going to affect, the things you value, which can affect your character. She continues here, we are preparing your child for a prosperous future. And there was, of course, a little bit more to the article. But you see, that was a school that had to deal with that. But they weren't just focusing on the students there, because with parents, it was a problem as well. So they had to go back, and seeing part of the problem. It's like William said, we would invite parents to come to the classes that their students, had to have, so that they can learn too. They can learn the value of respect. They can learn self-control. They can learn why it's important to be honest, right? And these lessons are not just for the students. So the parents could actually, if they would show support for the positive, the morality that these schools are trying to enforce and instill in the minds of the students. Now, they don't have it all, but there are some things that they do try to do right? Then it would make that learning environment better. It would see, the students would see, okay, yeah, mom or dad, they're not gonna fight for me on this. I just need to follow the instructions and conform, and that's a form of positive conformity, maintaining or staying within the dress code. All right, so let's go back to page 142 there. The next, oops, let's see, did I get that one there? Oh, you know what? Let's look at page 41 real quick, because I wanted to cover a couple of things on these shirts here. It says, try these on for size. And these are just, again, things you can reiterate in the minds of your students. You see that upper right-hand shirt there. It says, respect for yourself comes through loud and clear by the way you choose to dress. You choose to dress. So even in the situation where there might be a uniform policy enacted, and a child might think, well, this is forcing me. Well, no, that's what the school requires. So if you want to go to the school, you want to come in the classroom, then you must agree to dress in this manner. But even in that, you still have to choose to dress appropriately, to choose to dress respectfully. Notice the second one there. It says, fashion styles and trends will come and go, but you must always keep your self-respect. And lastly, it says, clothes have always been associated with human dignity and respect. Have you ever noticed that judges and other people of authority dress either in robes or suits? And that's still true to this very day. So now let's look back to 142. Number 2 there, it says, you should let your friends pressure you into being disrespectful by making sexually inappropriate comments. Of course, the answer for that would be a big false, right? And we'll look back there on page 142, or 141, sorry, and you look at the second smiley face underneath the girls tab. It says, if a young man speaks or acts inappropriately toward you, Then use self-control and do not smile or say anything that would show acceptance or appreciation of these comments. Again, I remind you to remind your students that this would apply to both the young girls and the boys, okay? Because girls can do the same thing, and we covered that under the note down there. That was the last thing that William covered in the previous class. Doing so would encourage more disrespectful behavior. Get away from him quickly as possible. And then if you look at the the second point there under the tab for the boys, it says, do not let your buddies pressure you into approaching a young woman and disrespecting her to prove how much of a man you are. Now remember, these are 11 to 13-year-olds that we're dealing with, so some of them haven't even had their voices crack yet, you know, and they think that approaching a young lady and pitching woo or, you know, throwing game or whatever is that'll prove how much of a man they really are, right? You know, I can go and talk to this girl and I can have her melt like butter in my hands, okay? And this will give you a high social status in life. No, it doesn't, right? It's a moment in time, but a moment that is worth very little in the scheme of things. But this comes again with that pressure, that peer pressure, right? That is coming from your buddy old pals who are trying to coerce you into engaging into these types of behaviors. If we look over to page 42 in the respect unit here, and this is under the section entitled Respect for Myself. And if you look at 1, 2, 3, bullet point number 3 and 4 there, it says, not falling for negative conformity and peer pressure. Well, what? Respect for myself means not falling for negative conformity and peer pressure. Respect for myself also means choosing friends who share my interests and respect my goals. Well, you know, an 11 to 13 or 14 or 15 or 16-year-old, it might not be in their goals to be chasing girls at that age, right? They might have the goal really just get an education at that point. Not that they don't have that desire, but they're, you know, setting realistic goals that they want that for the future. But they know a foundation has to be built. They know they have to be able to take care of them. They know they have to have the knowledge to know how to take care of themselves and the family. You know, they have to develop some type of support, which means they have to, you know, have some type of an education, whether they are going to go out and work for a company or they're going to go out and start a business, whatever the case might be. You know, so they set realistic goals. So, you know, your friends, you know, should to some degree share your interests, but also respect your goals, okay, and not be trying to force you or coerce you or influence you into doing things that could stymie those goals. We're going to look at the acceptance unit on page 67, and I actually have a slide for that. I've got it printed here, but it's a little bit too small for me to read, so I'm just going to read it out in the book here. The next slide is under who me conform. And this is just a, because we just refreshed your minds on the, you know, conformity and the dangers of it when it's negative. Now, of course, like we've covered before, there's positive conformity, and that's what we want to accentuate. But they have to be mindful also of the negative conformities so they can avoid those things as well. So you see on page 67 of the acceptance unit for your notes there, and it says, who me conform. And at the very top it says, sometimes when making friends, you might find yourself conforming or changing the way you think, act, or feel in order to fit in and be accepted. Because friendships are based upon shared similarities, likes and dislikes, some conforming will naturally occur. For example, all your friends like a certain designer shirt, so soon, of course, you get that as well. Let's look at the next paragraph. It says, one of the most common forms of conformity is called peer pressure. And that's what we're talking about. Don't let your friends, your peers, pressure you into these things. Peer pressure is when you feel like you must behave in a certain way in order for your friends to respect you or see you as equal. Now, if they were taking the lessons to heart from what they're learning in the Peaceful Solution, you know, they would know that respect is something that they deserve, irregardless of whether they conform or not. Right? It's something that just must be given. It's actually their friend's obligation to show them respect. Peer pressure can either be positive or negative. And you see here under the next topic, it says, it's always right to conform to something morally positive and beneficial. Conforming to positive moral standards that help to build positive character causes no harm to yourself or others. Positive conformity encourages you to make moral choices. And of course, this push and this influence for you to go and talk to, some young lady that could lead to a relationship, that could lead to inappropriate behaviors, those types of things won't help you to build a positive character. Those things will go against your making of moral choices and so forth, and reaching your goals, right? That can just totally throw a monkey wrench in reaching your goals. Not to say that people who have made those choices haven't been able to rebuild, from and recover from those choices and the consequences that follow, some things for a lifetime, right? But they acknowledge that, had I not done this, I would have been a lot farther along. So it's not a mission impossible. Remember, with the peaceful solution, as long as there's life and determination, a person can learn. They can change. But they're going to have to deal with the choices that they made in the process. Okay, because those consequences, they just don't automatically go away. So it's prevention. As it said, an ounce of prevention is far more better than a pound of cure. But we've got the cure too in the peaceful solution. Positive conformity here, notice here, is when you are encouraged to obey proper authority. You keep yourself and others safe and are encouraged to support and practice moral values. And if you look over to page 68 here, which is on the next slide, it says, you do not need to compromise positive morals or character for the sake of friendship. And that's something that young people, it takes them a little while. It seems like sometimes they don't really grasp that lesson until way later on in life. And then they actually see what true friends are, what a true friendship is. In high school, everything seems like it's emotionally based and a lot of drama with it. You do not need to compromise positive morals or character for the sake of friendship. In fact, you can have even better friends by practicing the lessons learned from the Peaceful Solution Character Education Program and standing firm on true values and positive moral character. However, if you recognize that you have conformed to something wrong, so if you've allowed your friends to pressure you and you've done or you've said something inappropriate or disrespectful to someone of the opposite sex, it's okay to change and conform to something positive. You're not stuck, right? It's not a mission impossible. And a lot of the young men and the young women have already done these things. But encourage them, help them to understand that they don't have to be stuck in that rut. They can change and actually conform to something positive. You are urged by the Peaceful Solution Character Education Program to become a leader yourself in guiding others to safety and teaching positive morals and character. Then you will have many loyal friends because, the people you associate with there to some degree are going to share, your interests and your goals, your likes and so forth, your dislikes. So you want those things to be in line or on point with what you're learning in the Peaceful Solution. In fact, a lot of people pick up new friends, so to speak. I don't mean pick up, but they meet new friends going through the Peaceful Solution course. Negative conformity is when you are encouraged to disobey a proper authority figure. We should only disobey authority who ask us to do wrong. Okay? And it's not what we think is wrong. Remember, the standard's already been set in the Peaceful Solution there. Negative conformity is when you compromise your safety or the safety of others. And it's when you go against moral values that you have set your mind to follow, right? So in order for their minds to be set to follow those things, they have to be educated. They have to be taught. Otherwise, what are they going to set their minds on? I want to do better. Well, that's a great goal. How do you do better? What are the steps that you must take to do better? What are the things that you're doing wrong that prevents you from doing better? So now we have to know what to eliminate and what to accentuate. That only comes through education, and that is our job as teachers. All right, so let's look at point number 3 there. A little bit further here. You should never make comments about someone's physical development. course, that's true. You should never make comments about someone's physical development, whether it's a young man or a young woman. Okay, and that kind of tied into what we covered in the last two points there. And what the last point is on underneath that note, which I want to try to get to here before we finish out today. We'll just probably come back and revisit if we need to. The point number 4 there, it says, one way you can earn respect from members of the opposite sex is by having self-respect. And that is, earn a higher degree of respect, from members of the opposite sex. They'll see that you carry yourself in a certain manner, right? And there are kind of different levels of respect, as we covered previously. There are basic, right, and there's higher degrees of respect. But a person can actually earn a higher degree of respect from members of the opposite sex by having just respect for themselves. And that's the problem. A lot of people nowadays, because they haven't been taught these concepts, these lessons, they just have a careless attitude. Whatever it is, what's the old song? Whatever will be, will be. I just living one day at a time, taking it on the cuff. No, people have to have respect for themselves. They have to understand that they have value. Problem is that a lot of people haven't been taught that they have value. They haven't been shown from the very onset in their own homes or families. That is, if they, everybody had some influence in how they were brought up, whether they had their parents or some guardians, or they lived in foster care, or whatever the case might be. But a lot of people haven't been taught or shown that they have value. Now, it might be hard to think, how can a person go through their childhood never being shown value or respect? There are a lot of cases like that. A lot of people, a lot of young people are in homes where the parent just has them because of the stipend that they receive from the government for foster care. I knew people like that growing up, and I thought it was pretty sad because I thought it was unfair to the child. Yeah, they had a roof over their head. Yes, they had clothing, but that's not all a child needs. They need to know that they're appreciated. They need to know that they're cared for. They need to have somebody that they can go and talk to when things are rough, and they need to be guided in the proper direction. They need to be shown proper morals so that they can make better choices when they get older in life. Some people, they never get that, right? And so as teachers of the Peaceful Solution, this is something that we have to keep in mind when we encounter both young people and adults, that they just might not have had that opportunity that we might have had growing up, and growing up in a loving home. And so through our example and through our diligent effort in maintaining a positive character, we can actually show them respect and show them that they have value and how to respect themselves for the very first time in their life. But just real quick here, I wanted to show some of the costs of sexual harassment, because these are some of the things that William talked about at the last. Let me see. I think we'll probably save it for the next class there. But just look at that note there on the bottom of page 141. It says, "Boys, you are just as vulnerable to sexual comments and jokes as girls. Because there are so many mixed messages regarding appropriate sexual behavior, many young women think that young men should show interest in them by making sexual comments. Many young men feel they are not men unless they say or do something that is sexual in nature. This is a serious misconception that comes from living in a society that constantly sends out negative messages regarding respectful behavior. In some cases, sexual harassment can lead one to court. So be wise." And I think hopefully we'll pick up on that in that last point. Yes, in our next class. So we're going to stop right there. So our next class is going to be this coming Wednesday, the 19th, and that'll be at 5:30, of course, Central Standard Time. We look forward to seeing you there, and we hope you enjoyed today's class. Have a wonderful day. Take care, everyone.